what a man in the middle is precisely that introduction. That's a white card charge, but these other things I've talked about, let's talk about the Phuket blowout we had. So this group in Thailand, very clever, had basically added a computer right here called a MIM, a man in the middle, and sometimes they're called kingpins. If they're a kingpin, if they also send out controls, they're generally just called a man in the middle if they intercept information. Now what happened is they had all of Phuket, where all those people are vacationing, all this information was coming in, and they were basically watching for things that were not cards that they didn't want and not phone calls. This was a very cleverly controlled computer that understood what the transmission signal of a credit card charge looked like, and then would copy the whole thing. And then what they would do is every single card that they wanted, they'd add $100 in charge to a casino, get the chips, and then cash the chips out. So then you come back from your vacation, you know, Mrs. Smith has come back to Long Island, and she gets the bill, and she goes to Mr. Smith and says, "What night did you spend $100 at the casino?" And he goes, "I didn't spend $100 at the casino. You must have spent $100 at the casino. Remember this?" She goes, "I didn't spend $100, I spent $20, and my $20 charge is here." So then it becomes a question, do Mr. and Mrs. Smith want to call anyone and fight about $100 that they had on vacation that neither of them are really sure if they spent it or not? It was a very clever gang, and they were doing it to 50, 60, 70, 80 cards a day. Right? That's a MIM. Now, let's say instead of wanting to intercept credit card charges, I wanted to change a vote. Well then, I just need to figure out, here's my voting machine out there, and my voting machine has got people who drive it to the county tabulators, but I'm going to erase this and now go to an architecture that's closer. Now you understand the process of how it happens. Let's talk about how voting tends to happen. So we've got all these voting machines out here. This is my polling place, and then the voting machines generally have a human being, not always, but a human being takes them apart and gets a bucket of memory cards, basically. These are my memory cards. And then they physically drive to the county tabulator, and there's basically a series of computers involved now. So at the county, I basically will have a thing that looks sort of like a printer, but it's got a slot. You stick the card in there, and then there's a reader screen, and then there's some kind of transmission computer, which is usually some old Dell computer or something sitting there. Sorry, Dell, if it's not a Dell computer. But it's whatever county computer they could get that's cheap that has the Windows CE system. So this is the first part of my network. Now what they do is they put that in, and it reads the thing, and we look at the results, and then adds it to the total tabulation. Then what happens is it transmits again through a local switch into a PBX, into an opto switch, through the optical switch up here, and then back out into a PBX, and back out into another Dell computer that's at the Secretary of State's office. That's the final state tabulation. That's how it happens. Now the question becomes, where would you want the MIM? And back now we're going to go specifically October 2004, Ohio. What I have asserted, and if people think I'm wrong, great, we'll go to discovery. And as I've repeatedly said, if I'm wrong, in my job, I'm wrong 15, 20% of the time. Great, I was wrong. I didn't figure out where the thieves were. I admit it. We move on, we fix it. I'm right about 80% of the time, which is why a lot of companies hire me. What it looks like to me happened, and I said this, was that somebody had installed a kingpin, which was taking not just, and now we'll go ahead and change colors here, see if my red pen works today. They were taking a kingpin, and I suggested the kingpin had to be out there. Red's working okay today. So the kingpin, I thought, was probably sitting somewhere in the middle on the high-speed line. And the kingpin is a computer with a person sitting at it that doesn't just steal the information and then they use it later like we saw. It's a person who has on board their kingpin computer the code and instructions for the Secretary of State's office and the code and instructions for a county tabulator. Now, as I said, most of these county tabulators, tons of them, are this extremely poorly designed architectures on relatively old software. It's very well established. There's tons. I mean, you guys can find lots of examples of people who've shown how to hack the code. But I'm not talking about the specific hack. I'm talking about the fact this guy has got copies of the code or has already introduced in these things routines that are communication routines to talk to his kingpin. So then what he does is he sits there, and instead of this happening, this happens. And in addition to that data flow going through there, the control information in red to go back to these can be driven as well. So now what happens is county tabulates everything up, is constantly talking back and forth saying, I've got 10% of my vote. And the kingpin says, wonderful, what's the total? Now, you think you're talking to the Secretary of State, but you're not. You're talking to the kingpin. And then you say, it's this, and the kingpin says, okay, great. And then it passes out to the Secretary of State. So the kingpin doesn't have to make itself seen. It can choose to pass everything through until it decides to say, now I've got a problem. You know, so at 9 o'clock in the evening, Kerry's leading in Ohio. And the kingpin is watching these results go through, and this operator is sitting here at a company called Smart Tech Solutions. We now know. And remember, when I speculated this, everyone said, that's ridiculous, that's completely impossible. Well, we now found out that not only was I right, we know where it was sent. We didn't just have it introduced, it was designed into the Secretary of State's office that they could switch the control from their computer talking to the counties to have a Smart Tech do it. So, great, I was right. So now, everybody's saying, well, yeah, you were right, we're sending a Smart Tech, but they didn't do anything wrong. Well, then why were you sending it to them? So these guys at Smart Tech, they're now looking at the things going by, and they finally make a decision. We need more Bush votes. So what they started doing was, in counties where they already knew that there was a Republican county coordinator, they already knew they were going to win the county, they started padding the vote to cover the differences in the place that had been too dangerous, and they would have gotten caught had they done it. So in these places, they were already heavily Republican. They'd probably looked and said, okay, votes have come in from this precinct, and we'll take away 50 Kerry votes and add 50 to Bush, and then send it on. And then what's great is we'll then send back to the tabulator and change the tabulator level too, which is very simple to do. If you've ever called up the customer service help desk and all of a sudden watched them changing something inside your computer, you'll go, oh my gosh, how are they doing that? Well, it's because they have the ability to do it if you have the code of what's at both ends, which we know the guys at Smart Tech had. So that's how I have repeatedly, first I speculated that's what it was, and then it was discovered in fact that this actual centerpiece existed, and then we found out who owned it, and then we also found out it's also doing Karl Rove's email. Like, that's brilliant. I mean, it's like, I'm humbled that that was that obvious. So, and of course now we'll find out as the case moves along whether or not anyone wants to do anything about it. But, you know, when you're working on a criminal case, and I've worked on tons of criminal cases, do the criminals have the means? Do they have a method? Do they have the motivation? Well, motivation, I want to steal the presidency because it's a really powerful position. Got it. Do I have the method? Well, this was the method I speculated existed when it happened, and everyone said I was out of my mind. Well, we now have all the documentation to prove, yes, actually, the method was set up. And then did they have the means? As it turns out, at 9:32 in the evening on Election Day, October 2004, every county stopped reporting directly to the Secretary of State and sent everything to this kingpin. And the kingpin then decided what was sent in each direction. Bang. In my world of credit cards, which is where I make my living, if I had speculated about this and even had one tiny shred of evidence, sitting across from me would not be fine people like yourself who are documentary filmmakers. I'd have Secret Service and FBI lined up saying how to go get them, because they all get feathers in their caps and get prizes and win. Instead, there seems to be a deafening silence from the Department of Justice on these issues. But they're busy. They're very busy. They're hunting down all kinds of child pornographers and I mean, there's a lot of other people out there that are bad people. So this is just a low priority. I mean, it's just a democracy, so it's not particularly high priority.